I'm Eric Beerbohm in the Department of Government and Social Studies, and it's my great pleasure to chair this panel, Social Inequality and Economic Justice. So 2 years after A Theory of Justice was published, come to order. A mere 2 years after A Theory of Justice was published, Frank Michelman wrote a classic article in Constitutional Welfare Rights in which he gave us a warning. He compared Rawls' book to a cathedral, and he said that its depth, subtlety, richness, and complexity may initially impede our comprehension of it. But he did end up being incredibly prescient because he worried the sense in which the difference principle was stuck with a make it better and make it bigger mentality. That is a maximizing mentality, and struggled to make sense of that with Rawls's picture of the social basis for self-respect. It was that article that began thinking of Rawls's picture as a theory not of distributive justice, as a distributive equality as an ideal, but as a political ideal. Equality is a higher order ideal that Elizabeth Anderson and Sam Scheffler have pursued with great force and vigor. And I think one of the things that unifies our exciting panel, really extraordinary panel today, is that you have three scholars who are taking equality as a political value. They're grounded in particular practices, whether the workplace, the family, and the university. And so we begin with Joey Fishkin from the School of Law, University of Texas at Austin, who works at the boundaries or borders of equality and law. And his book, Bottlenecks, thinks about equality of opportunity in a fresh way, imagines it negatively, and looks for obstacles to inequality applied to education, segregation, integration. Hailing from our philosophy department, Gina Schouten's work ranges across gender justice, educational justice, and political legitimacy. Her book project, Liberalism, Neutrality, and Gender Division of Labor, focuses on inequalities in gender and education, including higher education. And she's asking whether political liberalism can do the kind of work to show how deeply illegitimate some of the practices in these two domains can indeed be. Lucas Stanczyk, also from philosophy, is at work on two book manuscripts. His first, From Each, asks the question, how should we organize the production of the goods we need? A deceptively simple question that has not often been asked within the post-Rawlsian liberal egalitarian framework. His other book manuscript challenges how much work our idea of equality of opportunity can do. I think he doubts that it can serve, as one point Tim Scanlon suggested, the Trojan horse of egalitarianism, and I suspect that that may lead to some crossfire between him and Joey today. So without further ado, let's start with Joey Fishkin.
So thanks so much to Michael Rosen and to Ludek Sakira for... Yes, I could. Is this better? Yes? Even closer to the mic? Okay. Okay, here we go. So, thanks so much to Michael Rosen, to Ludek Sakira. So, when I first read A Theory of Justice in graduate school, the part that grabbed me the most and that has continued to be the most generative in my own work was Rawls's conception of fair equality of opportunity. And I think it grabbed me in part because it's bound up with one of the things that I like most about the theory of justice, which is its non-utopianism. Rawls's well-ordered society is idealized only in certain respects. One of the ways in which it is refreshingly realistic is that it includes some differences in income and wealth. Those differences obviously immediately raise some big questions. If different jobs and roles in society give you different incomes, enable you to accumulate different amounts of wealth, then we have to confront questions of justice in who gets those jobs and roles, which is part of why fair equality of opportunity plays such a fundamental role in the theory, and part of why I think Rawls, in the theory of justice, although maybe he wavered later, gave it lexical priority over the difference principle. I mean, without FEO, the difference principle has a very different character. Allocating income and wealth between hereditary economic royalty and their peasants presents questions of fairness that are actually quite interesting, but those are very different from the questions Rawls is asking. And that understates the importance of FEO. Rawls argues that FEO plays a second, even more profound role, and I think this is the part that grabbed hold of my imagination the most when I first read it, and it's a point that both Tim Scanlon and Leif Wenar highlighted yesterday, so I'll just read you a slightly longer version of the same quote you've already heard. Rawls argues that without fair equality of opportunity, if some places were not open on a fair basis to all, those kept out would be right in feeling unjustly treated, not only because they were excluded from certain external rewards of office, but because they were debarred from experiencing the realization of self, which comes from a skillful and devoted exercise of social duties. They would be deprived of one of the main forms of human good. This focus on the realization of self is important. What Rawls is saying is that fair equality of opportunity is not only about distributive fairness in what we get, it's also about justice in who we become. Rawls is drawing here on what he calls the Aristotelian principle, the idea that's probably the closest the theory of justice comes to perfectionist thinking, which holds in part that human beings enjoy the exercise of their realized capacities. But who will have the opportunity to even develop, let alone realize, different capacities? Here, I think we start to see that fair equality of opportunity is much more than a fair system for deciding who gets the fancy jobs with the high salaries. It's important, that's important work, but on a deeper level, FEO is about justice in human development, which is a very challenging subject for justice, but also an essential one. So, what exactly is FEO? Rawls offers several related, slightly different formulations. You've heard some of them quoted. Each one holds that people's prospects should not be affected by their social class. But rather than holding that everyone's prospects should be identical, or maybe probabilistically the same ex ante from birth or something like that, Rawls offers a series of variables on which our prospects should depend under fair equality of opportunity. He writes, in all sectors of society, there should be roughly equal prospects of culture and achievement for those similarly motivated and endowed, or a different point, more specifically, assuming that there is a distribution of natural assets, those who are at the same level of talent and ability and have the same willingness to use them should have the same prospects of success regardless of their initial place in the social system. So that last formulation makes the premise explicit. There's some underlying distribution of natural assets, a natural lottery, which, for FEO to make any sense, must be a lottery that operates separately and independently from the lottery of social class. Similarly, if FEO is to work the way it's supposed to, there must be underlying differences in motivation that are not themselves dependent on social class. And although Rawls focuses on social class, because that's his sort of paradigm case throughout, it's equally true that for his argument to run, both ability and motivation must be similarly independent of other social factors such as gender, race, ethnicity, the place where a person happens to be born, etc. The word natural, thus, may be doing quite a lot of work here. For FEO to be even conceptually possible as formulated, Rawls needs there to be important sources of ability and motivation that lie outside the social structure. The argument doesn't work if the ability lottery is actually some sort of game played with loaded dice, biased toward those with more income and wealth. And similarly, FEO depends on the existence of sources of motivation and effort that lie outside the social structure, presumably somewhere deep in the recesses of the self, in a place where society did not influence or reach. If society's systematically building up the self-confidence and efficacy of one group of children and breaking down that in another group of children, and those two groups of children are defined even a little bit by social class, then we might have, roughly equal prospects of culture and achievement for everyone similarly motivated and endowed, but those prospects are going to be completely dependent on social class, which is exactly what fair equality of opportunity prohibits. Okay, the trouble is that both our abilities and our motivations are deeply dependent on the social structure, including class, and not just in our present society, which is obviously extremely unequal, but also even in the sort of society whose basic structure satisfies most of Rawls's theory, and that's the real trouble. Now, interestingly, I think Rawls saw this, whether or not he worked through all of its implications. Rawls acknowledges that in any society there are going to be families. The liberty to form a family is clearly among the basic liberties, and the institution of the family is part of the basic structure. that different families are going to provide their children with different upbringings. Those different upbringings affect their abilities and their motivations. And Rawls saw this. He writes, it's problematic to suggest we, quote, deserve the superior character that enables us to make the effort to cultivate our abilities because, quote, such character depends in good part upon fortunate family and social circumstances in early life for which we can claim no credit. So he clearly can see the point. That quote comes in an argument rejecting the idea that those with high levels of marketable skill have a desert claim on the full economic value of what they produce. But the point has clear implications for fair equality of opportunity. Rawls sees that even in a well-ordered society, different families will have somewhat different amounts of income and wealth. It follows logically from that different families will have somewhat different resources to devote to the upbringing of their children. Now, it'll be much less unequal in a well-ordered society than in our society, but there still will be some differences, and if those differences in resources can buy anything at all that is relevant to child development, like books or a better school or a safer neighborhood or a less unstable living situation or something like that, then it follows that what Rawls is here calling the fortunate family and social circumstances in early life are inevitably going to be at least a little bit class-linked. This means there's a fundamental tension within Rawlsian fair equality of opportunity. The idea that people's prospects should depend on their ability and motivation and should not depend on their starting point in the social structure. The tension is simply that both ability and motivation are dependent on one's place in the social structure, not only in practice, but also to some extent even in ideal theory. Okay, so how far can this point be pressed? Is there some core of natural talent and ability to be found underneath when you scrape away or adjust for or control for the layers of social advantage and disadvantage that have been piled on top of it? I think at the time that Rawls was writing, this idea seemed plausible. In addition to being the nadir of material inequality in the United States, the 1950s and 60s were also the age of greatest optimism about what were then bold new technologies of meritocracy, especially ability testing. Think of tests like the SAT. In the 1960s, such tests seemed to hold enormous promise. Instead of filling a place like Harvard with the prep school educated sons of old white Anglo-Saxon Protestant elites, these new technologies of meritocracy would enable Harvard to comb through the high-achieving 18-year-olds of America, find those who had the greatest natural talent and ability, and were the hardest working, regardless of their social background. And at the beginning, this really seemed to be working. It transformed Harvard itself. By the time Rawls published A Theory of Justice, many of those 18-year-olds were his students. Today, half a century later, this appealing picture of the relationship between meritocracy and social class, social mobility, has, I think it's fair to say, been shattered. Intelligence testing regimes that once seemed to promise equal opportunity to the most gifted regardless of class background now appear instead to be measuring something that is, on the whole, not perfectly, but extremely highly correlated with class background, because it's so dependent on educational and developmental experiences that are correlated with class. Today, there's just an overwhelming body of evidence from labor economics, psychology, and sociology that a lot of the important pathways by which social and economic inequalities are now transmitted from one generation to the next run through traits such as talents and abilities. That's how it works. Some of what's different now as compared to half a century ago is about advances in our understanding, but some of it is also changes on the ground, changes in who the elite are, how they pass down advantages to their children, and really instead of they, I should now say we. Instead of trying to pass down great land holdings like 18th century aristocrats, today's elite pass down the skills and educational experiences that give children superlative SAT scores and other indicia of merit. And such efforts don't always succeed, obviously, but they succeed consistently enough that, as Daniel Markovits has provocatively put it, American meritocracy has thus become precisely what it was invented to combat, a mechanism for the dynastic transmission of wealth and privilege across generations. This is the point to which Sam Scheffler alluded just a little while ago. Now, of course, you might say that may be true in practice, but why does it affect the theory? So here's why I think it does. When we imagine people reasoning about justice behind the veil of ignorance, they need general knowledge about how human beings behave, about how society works. If people go behind the veil with the knowledge that the way a modern meritocratic elite perpetuates itself is in large part by making sure their children have more of just the right kinds of talent and ability and motivation than other children, it seems hard to believe that anyone will emerge from behind the veil with a conception of FEO that turns entirely on making sure that people have the same prospects of success if and only if they have the same level of talent and ability and the same willingness to use them. People behind the veil are going to understand that somehow, even if we try to make opportunities more equal, families with more resources are somehow going to enable their children to score higher than everyone else's children on whatever talent and ability measures turn out to matter. So I'll tell you a little story parallel to this argument that I'm trying to make, diverting us a little about how changes in general knowledge ought to change our thinking about justice. So Rawls tries to draw a line in the theory of justice between natural primary goods and social primary goods, both important, both things that we all need to implement our rational plan of life, whatever it may be. And so he distinguishes natural primary goods such as health and vigor, intelligence and imagination, from the social primary goods, rights, liberties, opportunities, and income and wealth. And even half a century ago, Rawls could see, as we can see, as a matter of general knowledge, that even the natural primary goods are, he says, quote, influenced by the basic structure. But, he says, they're not so directly under its control as are the social primary goods. Okay. And with that, the natural primary goods seem to mostly drop out of the main analysis. But over the decades since the book's publication, scholars of epidemiology and public health produced a really impressive body of work on the social determinants of health. They conclusively identified a variety of pathways by which social class in particular influences health and vigor, so that these can no longer plausibly be viewed as natural rather than social primary goods. And Rawls, to his great credit, reacted to this evidence, and maybe I think to the work of Norman Daniels, long after the publication of A Theory of Justice by correctly concluding that health is indeed a primary social good, which Rawls saw entailed the further conclusion that society must ensure a basic level of health care provided by all. The same kind of reckoning is overdue for the rest of the so-called natural primary goods, including intelligence. As with health, there's plenty of luck involved in intelligence, but it's not the luck of a pure natural lottery independent of the basic structure. Instead, we now know it's a complex series of somewhat loaded dice rolls throughout childhood and adulthood about whether we'll have the kinds of opportunities and experiences that grab our interest, cause us to exert effort, dig deeper, and develop the mental abilities that some of which get grouped as intelligence and all of which turn out to be in different ways dependent on experience. This means we need a more profound rethinking, a real reassessment of Rawlsian fair equality of opportunity. It's not going to work for the heart of the theory to depend on isolating talent and effort from circumstances of birth. People behind the veil of ignorance with today's background knowledge are going to emerge, I think, with something different from this. One superficially appealing response in our genetics-obsessed age is to try to instead double down on the idea of isolating natural talent and effort by defining FEO as the state of affairs where people with equal genetic predispositions toward talent or effort have equal prospects of success. This approach rests on a sort of tale about genetics in which our genes are fixed from birth and they have stable effects independent of environment on ability and motivation. There are two problems with this gene-centric version of FEO, each serious enough on its own, I think, to be disqualifying. The first is that even if the tale about genetics that I just told were true, gene-centric FEO is not morally appealing. Imagine that someone manages through some combination of sheer happenstance and dogged persistence to develop an exceptional talent that's unusual among members of her social class. And suppose this occurs despite her having no particular genetic predisposition relevant in one direction or the other. Her genes are average. Yet somehow with just the right mentor, the right spark, the right circumstances, she surprises herself and everybody else by becoming really good at whatever this talent entails. a Rawlsian egalitarian ought to care that society now give her the same prospects of success as someone else whose equally impressive talent in the same sphere came about through sheer effortless superiority, because according to our tale, they were born with it in their genes. But gene-centric FEO requires only that those with equal relevant genes have equal prospects of success, and has nothing to say about the prospects of our average gened wonder who got there a different way. So that's one problem. The other problem is the whole tale is false. It's not the case that our genes and environment have distinct effects on who we become. Rather than part of our talents being due to genes and part to environment, 100% of our talents are due to the interaction of the two. And this is true even at the extremes, where things seem the most purely genetic. Nothing ever is. So consider, there's an example that will be familiar to some of you, phenylketonuria. In the 1930s, when this disease was discovered, it was clear if you had the gene, you would have serious intellectual disabilities and also seizures and other problems. By the 1950s, we found out there's this very unusual diet that will allow people with this genetic marker to develop completely normally. Obviously, not every genetic disorder has that kind of simple environmental fix, but environment includes medical interventions that alter gene products through pharmaceuticals, and now increasingly the explosion of gene editing technology, such as CRISPR, allows us to change not just gene expression, but genes, at which point the tale that you were telling about a purely genetic lottery really unravels even at its base, because in the near future, and indeed in some cases in the present, the key lottery for a genetic disorder may be the lottery of whether you're born into a family that can afford to get you a technology like CRISPR, or a society whose basic structure includes a system of socialized medicine that provides it. All of that is crucial constitutive luck in who you become, but it's not purely genetic luck. It's interaction all the way down. And this goes for abilities as much as for disabilities. To really understand either abilities or disabilities, you end up needing a social model of both. All this leads me to conclude that we need something quite different from FEO, some set of ideas about the structure and distribution of opportunities that doesn't depend on the sort of conceptually impossible project of isolating talent and effort from circumstances of birth. What makes this challenge especially daunting is that we also need to solve it in a way that is consistent with the priority of the basic liberties, which includes the liberty to form families. Those families are inevitably going to give children different opportunities of different kinds. This is an independent problem for Rawls that he never resolves, because he says FEO has lexical priority over the difference principle. We're not going to trade them off against each other, but given the existence of families, fair equality of opportunity can never be fully achieved, so it is hard to figure out how to resolve that. So, behind the veil of ignorance, suppose that we imagine that we know opportunities won't be perfectly equal. We can work to make them a lot less unequal, but some people will be more qualified than others for reasons that reflect the luck of where in the social structure they were born. What then? Even the people with less of that kind of luck deserve opportunities, not only a fair chance to become qualified for the more desirable and well-paying jobs and so on, but also, if Rawls is right, and I think he is, opportunities to develop and exercise our capacities, because that's one of the main forms of human good. So, part of what I think might then emerge from behind the veil of ignorance, and this is an argument that I develop much more in my book Bottlenecks, is something like what I call opportunity pluralism. Here the idea is that instead of having the shape of a pyramid-like tournament in which everyone is aspiring to get the same desirable jobs and roles with which everyone values, and at each stage in the tournament the most qualified are sort of pitted against one another in meritocratic contests, what if instead there were lots of different desirable jobs and roles which different people valued for different reasons, and which did not all demand the same credentials or skills or define merit in quite the same way? To move toward opportunity pluralism, a society has to find ways to loosen the bottlenecks in its opportunity structure, the narrow places through which you have to pass to reach a lot of different opportunities that open out on the other side. So for instance, a college degree might be a bottleneck if most good jobs require it, and even worse if the only way to obtain it is to do well on certain tests at the age of 18. A particular skill like speaking English is often a bottleneck. If opportunities are geographically concentrated, then the place where you grow up will be a bottleneck. If it takes a lot of money to afford health care and a safe neighborhood and a lot of other things that nearly everybody wants, then that makes money into more of a bottleneck. So to loosen bottlenecks, you can make it easier for people to get through the bottleneck, to learn English, to get the college degree, or around the bottleneck, which would mean increasing the range of opportunities that don't require English or that don't require the degree. As we make the opportunity structure more open and pluralistic, we reduce the extent to which you have to make certain choices and develop certain skills at early ages like 11 or 18, or else you're forever barred from large numbers of paths that you might want to pursue. So instead, we look for ways to create on-ramps back on to the highways of opportunity for people who made an early exit, even if that exit was entirely their own responsibility. The idea here, the point here is twofold. In part, it's to reshape the opportunity structure so that the early inequalities of opportunity that can't be eliminated, and some of which maybe shouldn't be eliminated, are less consequential. Opportunity pluralism lowers the stakes of meritocratic competition in a way that helpfully alters incentives. It means life is less winner-take-all and more of a series of different contests offering incommensurable rewards that could be undertaken at different stages in life so that hopefully the loser in one is a winner in another more often. And in that way, here's sort of the second part of the point of doing this. I think opportunity pluralism can also do a lot of work to help implement some points that lurk in the background of Rawls's theory of justice. And Leif Wenar brought out some of these yesterday in a really arresting and interesting way. So I'll just focus on one more that I think changing the opportunity structure in this way would help. And that's the idea that it matters for everyone to have a chance to conceive of and try to implement their own rational plan of life. As we make opportunity structures more pluralistic, that idea becomes more realistic. If the opportunities are too tournament-like, too pyramidal, with only a few jobs and roles that everyone wants clustered at the top, then the opportunity structure itself will narrow and channel people's desires and plans. You can formulate your own rational plan of life, but the only really rational plan of life is to try to win that tournament. We can do better than that, and I think we ought to try. But in order to do it, I think we have to reason about justice in a somewhat different way. Instead of imagining a well-ordered society and working backward from there to draw conclusions about the present world, implementing opportunity pluralism would require that we begin instead, as Tim Scanlon did, we begin instead with the unjust world we have and reason about how to improve the opportunity structure and make it more pluralistic. There's no end point to this improvement. I think there's no threshold where we could say we have completely satisfied all the requirements of justice. I think, and perhaps Lucas will disagree, I think that that's a feature and not a bug, in part because Rawlsian FEO turns out to be something that cannot be fully achieved either, even in ideal theory. So I think we do better to begin from a non-ideal starting point and reason together about how to renovate the opportunity structure in steps, aiming in each step to make it a little more open and a little less unjust. Thank you.
So thanks very much. It's such a privilege just to get to be here for this event and an immense honor to have the opportunity to speak at it. So thanks to Michael and to the organizers for thinking to include me in this. I'm really, really honored to be here. In the basic liberties and their priority, I should say the handout is for this talk. So you've had plenty of time to study it now. So I hope you're ready. In the basic liberties and their priority, Rawls says that the protection for the basic liberties in their central range of application, quote, is a condition of the adequate development and full exercise of the two moral powers of citizens as free and equal persons. And it's this connection between the basic liberties and our fundamental interests as citizens that affords the liberties their sort of normative weightiness in the theory. In political liberalism, this connection and the mandate to protect the basic liberties acts as a constraint on what can count as a reasonable political conception of justice. And these constraints, I think, are the relationally egalitarian aspect of Rawlsian political liberalism, and that they're derived from the fundamental bedrock commitment, ideal of political liberalism, of arranging terms of social cooperation to facilitate mutual respect among free and equal citizens. And in the longer paper from which this talk is drawn out, I argue that relational egalitarianism should be thought of, or could fruitfully be thought of, as a theory of legitimacy, one part of which concerns these very constraints on what can count as a reasonable political conception of justice. But the shorter version of the paper that I'm going to talk through today just makes a smaller point that comes in the context of that bigger project. And I want to argue that the constraints imposed on any political conception of justice by this ideal of mutual respect are more robustly distributively egalitarian than is commonly thought. And that matters because that means that those distributive requirements have categorically the same moral status as protection for the basic liberties. That doesn't mean that a failure to realize the distributive requirements is as egregious a failure as a systematic failure to protect the basic liberties, but it's on a par. It falls in the same category. These are constraints. This would be a problem, not just a problem of justice by the lights of whatever political conception of justice happens to order our society, but rather a failure to live up to the ideal of mutual respect that delineates the space of reasonable political conceptions at all. Okay, so section 1, just sort of briefly this connection between moral respect and liberal legitimacy. So the aspiration of political liberalism is to find ways of achieving stability of a social arrangement over time, despite the fact of reasonable pluralism and the inevitability of reasonable pluralism when we live in liberal democratic institutions, or a society ordered by liberal democratic institutions. And the strategy for surmounting this problem is to try to maintain relations of mutual respect among free and equal citizens by abiding by a justificatory constraint of reciprocity. And so we arrange our society on terms that we can all recognize as called for on the basis of reasons that in turn we can all recognize as such. If we want to do political liberalism as non-ideal theory, then this constraint applies to any political interventions that we might enact in order to move closer to that society. And the idea is that we exercise our shared democratic political power only in ways that we can all recognize as called for, even though it might burden us asymmetrically because we disagree about what constitutes a valuable way of life or a valuable social end that we might pursue collectively. And the mandate that any reasonable political theory, conception of justice has to protect the basic liberties attests to something important, which is that these shareable reasons impose not just negative constraints against acting politically in ways that we can't justify to our fellow citizens, but they also impose positive requirements on certain political protections that we must have in order for our society to be one wherein mutual justification can happen. So these shareable reasons that we can use to justify our institutional arrangement to citizens that disagree with us about so many things include the reasons that stem from this basic bedrock commitment of political liberalism, which is to arrange our institutions on terms of mutual respect among citizens construed as free and equal. Okay, so among the things that that bedrock commitment compels us to do, Rawls includes these 3. Specify and protect certain rights, liberties, and opportunities, afford special priority to these rights, liberties, and opportunities, ensure for all citizens adequate all-purpose means to make effective use of these rights, liberties, and opportunities. So that third requirement is already distributive, and it's already distributively egalitarian, but I want to argue that this sort of bedrock aspiration of political liberalism is more distributively egalitarian, and distributively egalitarian in a way that hasn't yet been recognized, then even this sort of third criterion that Rawls acknowledges shows us. And the idea is that the criterion of reciprocity demands this distributive equality because it protects these essential interests that we share as free and equal citizens. Okay, so section 2 is sort of the received wisdom, or the version of the received wisdom that I favor about what distributively this commitment to securing mutual respect among free and equal but profoundly divided ideologically citizens entails. So as a constraint that imposes both positive and negative requirements, relational egalitarian politically liberal legitimacy effectively imposes an adequacy threshold as a distributive requirement. Here I'm drawing on Elizabeth Anderson's democratic equality in particular. It demands for each citizen adequate food, shelter, education, medical care, economic opportunities, and other material goods necessary for equal standing and participation in civil society. So that's already a robustly egalitarian distributive upshot of this ideal of mutual respect and relational egalitarianism more generally. And in fact, there's egalitarian content even in this adequacy threshold. And I think we can see this in different ways. We can talk about the possibility of hostile outbreaks of envy even above the adequacy threshold. But I think maybe one of the clearest ways to illustrate this is to just talk about the positional value of the political liberties. So ignore the market maximizers for now. I actually won't need to invoke that example just to make this simple point. The income and wealth, the social product that we use as a means of exercising our political liberties, has positional value because the space of the public political forum is limited. And so my share of income and wealth is a less valuable means of leveraging political influence insofar as other citizens have a greater share of income and wealth. And so what I say on the handout is that the threshold, the adequacy threshold, can actually rise as some of the citizens who are above it become better and better off. But I think maybe the more careful way to put it, because the adequacy threshold is just defined in terms of the capacities of citizenship, is that some citizens can fall below that threshold as other citizens come to have more and more. So the adequacy threshold is itself already egalitarian. And that's according to the sort of received wisdom, as I said, particularly democratic egalitarians, in terms of what the distributional upshots of mutual respect, of relational equality are. Okay, I think that these distributive egalitarian requirements of mutual respect are more robust still, but more importantly, robust in a way that's different than the sort of equal distribution upshots of the adequacy threshold. And that's because, and this is under section 3, relational egalitarian politically liberal legitimacy imposes demands of distributive equality because the ideal of mutual respect among free and equal citizens favors a baseline of distributive equality against which deviations must be justified, and it rules out talent as a permissible justification. So this, I think, should sound like it's going to be a hard case to make. Relational egalitarians explicitly deny that their view favors this baseline of distributive equality. Again, the distributive equality in question is shares of the social product over the course of a lifetime. What I think has gone unnoticed is that mutual respect commits us to treating as equally morally important each citizen's pursuit of her own values. And treating as equally important each citizen's pursuit of her own values means that our investment in that pursuit in terms of the social product that we create from our interdependence, the benefits and burdens of our social cooperation, should be devoted equally to each citizen. So to see why that's true, I'm just going to draw on an argument due to Shauna Schifrin. And what she's doing in this argument is wading into the debate between Rawls and Cohen about the basic structure restriction. And very quick and dirty version, this debate concerns whether Rawls is right that the principles of justice apply first and foremost to the institutional structure of society. And so one of the ways that Cohen tries to convince us that Rawls is wrong about that is by appealing to our intuition that we can, if we imagine a society, imagine two societies and they have identical institutional arrangements, say that both of them meet to a T the requirements of justice as versus fairness. But in one society, we have individuals who are acting in ways that frustrate egalitarian ends. So they're demanding extra salary for their exercise of their socially valuable talents. That society is going to be less egalitarian, but Cohen says if Rawls is right that justice is just a virtue of institutions, then we can't regard it as thereby less just. And so we're supposed to think that justice actually applies to the behavior of individuals as well. And Schifrin argues that even if Cohen's wrong about that, we can still impugn the behavior of the market maximizers. And her argument for this just pulls on the definition of a well-ordered society. So a Rawlsian well-ordered society is a society wherein citizens accept the principles of justice that order it, and they accept the justification for those principles. And fundamental to the justification for the difference principle is the idea that talents are arbitrary with respect to the distribution of income and wealth from a moral point of view. And so citizens in a well-ordered society who accept that justification for their social arrangement can't with integrity then leverage their own talents for a greater share of income and wealth. That would be acting in a way that's civically unvirtuous given that they accept as a justification for their institutional arrangement the arbitrariness of talent with respect to income and wealth. Okay, so the difference principle is just part of one reasonable political conception of justice. And what I'm trying to do is argue that the sort of considerations that constrain the domain of reasonable political conceptions of justice impose distributive egalitarian requirements. So my invoking this argument just starts out by drawing on Schifrin's justification for this arbitrariness claim that she takes as part of the justification for the difference principle. And roughly the idea is that income and wealth enable the pursuit of a conception of the good. We all have an equally morally important interest in that, regardless of talent. So now quoting Schifrin, and this is at the top of the back of the handout, our equal interest in pursuing a conception of the good motivates the initial presumption of an equal distribution of income and wealth and explains why talent is arbitrary with respect to income and wealth. Because possession of talent is arbitrary, it cannot serve as a reason for an unequal distribution. So the crucial point for my purposes is that this premise that Schifrin thinks supports all on its own are regarding talent as arbitrary is in fact entailed by the ideal of mutual respect among free and equal citizens, which means that it's demanded by the commitments of relational egalitarianism. So our interest in treating as equally important each citizen's pursuit of their own values is paradigmatic among the citizenship interests that generate shareable political reasons that compel us to arrange our society in certain ways and constrain the reasonable political conceptions of justice. I should say that sort of in light of some of the talks earlier, so I'm talking about political liberalism and public reason, but my interest in this paper is more about the public reasons themselves and what the reasons demand, and less on the practice of exchanging public reason and how constrained we may be as actual citizens deliberating together in our democracy. Of course, that's an important question, but what I'm asking is what do the reasons that we're compelled as free and equal citizens to recognize as such demand in terms of our social arrangements. And so what I'm trying to do is add to Rawls's list of 3 conditions and say the sort of values that Rawls invokes to say that these 3 considerations delineate the space of reasonable conceptions of justice actually have these further distributive upshots. Okay, so if her argument is sound, then its distributive upshots, that's Schifrin's argument, if it's sound, its distributive upshots, including the presumption of an equal distribution of income and wealth, and the impermissibility of talent to serve as a justification for inequality, are called for not only on the basis of some particular political conception of justice, but also on the basis of the very commitment that adjudicates the reasonable from the unreasonable such conceptions, the fundamental ideal of mutual respect among free and equal citizens. The baseline of distributive equality and the impermissibility of invoking talent to justify deviations from it are verdicts of politically liberal legitimacy. All right, so just to maybe get this to be a little bit more clear, I want to contrast that with some considerations, so contrast talent with some considerations that can justify inequalities in shares of the social product. So the first thing to do is just point out that saying that there's this presumption, this baseline imposed by the ideal of mutual respect among free and equal citizens of equal shares of the social product is not to say that the various reasonable ways of life that we may use that product to pursue should be equally costly. So we might have unequal costliness of ways of life that are due to economies of scale or due to path dependencies, and the baseline that I've argued for doesn't impugn those. And in fact, those can be justified, again, by invoking the ideal of mutual respect, which gives us reason to defer to the choices of other citizens and our own past choices that generate the economies of scale and the path dependencies. It's also not going to impugn any distributive inequalities in shares of social product that correlate with talent. So for reasons that Joseph brought out in his talk, we can expect our freedom of association to give rise to inequalities in holdings of income and wealth that correlate with inequalities, differentials in our socially valuable talents. And that's because the very acts of partiality that parents engage in when they cultivate their children in certain ways are likely both to increase the children's prospect of having a super equal share of income and wealth and investments in human capital of the children. So given or assuming that we can't legitimately proscribe these acts of partiality, given that they're protected by freedom of affiliation, we're not going to be able to remove that correlation. So we might have inequalities in shares of income and wealth that correlate with talent, and those aren't impugned by the argument that I've given. In that case, it's the ideal of mutual respect, which justifies the protection for the basic liberties, that in turn imposes this protection for acts of partiality as an enactment of our freedom of association. So the ideal of mutual respect is what, in that case, is overriding its own presumption of equal shares of income and wealth that we can use to devote to our own values. And there are other cases like that. So remember, of course, that the sort of received wisdom about relational egalitarianism is that its distributive upshot is just this adequacy threshold. And so we have a case for unequal shares of income and wealth whenever we have differences in citizens' ability to convert income and wealth into the capacities that make up that threshold. So it might be that some people need larger shares just to reach the threshold of adequacy of being able to exercise your capabilities as a citizen. And in that case, the inequality in shares is not only just permitted, but positively called for by the ideal of mutual respect among citizens. In other cases, the ideal of mutual respect among citizens will just merely permit reasons to be furnished by the particular political conception of justice at hand. So it might be that the political conception of justice impugns even unearned bad brute luck in terms of our efficiency at converting social goods into capacities even above the threshold that adequacy protects. If so, then those inequalities in shares will be justified as well. So what we have here is sort of a conversion across metrics, because the egalitarian threshold that I've argued mutual respect imposes is in terms of shares of social product. But there are also productive demands of mutual respect. So again, we can imagine circumstances where we need to offer certain kinds of incentive inequalities just in order to generate enough social product that everyone can be brought up to meet the adequacy threshold that relational egalitarianism imposes. In those cases, the incentive inequalities are in fact demanded by the ideal of mutual respect, as I understand it. But still, here again, just like in parallel with the case of inequalities in our efficiency at converting social product into capacities, we might have an actual political conception of justice that licenses still greater inequalities even above. So it might be that we can achieve some social good by offering an incentive inequality even above the threshold, and that our particular political conception of justice gives us reason to do that. Mutual respect permits that even as a deviation against the baseline of equality. Okay, so the ideal of mutual respect imposes limits on how institutions can be arranged to reward market maximizing because it imposes this baseline of equal shares of income and wealth with which to pursue our conception of the good. And I also want to argue that it can sometimes impugn the behavior of individuals that makes the remaining permissible market maximizing necessary to achieve the social value in question. And here again, I draw on the rest of Schifrin's argument. So remember, what she's trying to do is to argue that there's this civic virtue that requires us to act in ways consistent with our acceptance of the justification for the political, the principles of justice that order our society. So she says, and here this is under section 4, if we are to treat possession of talents as arbitrary factors with respect to one's claim on the joint social product, then I should not ask for nor take advantage of higher salaries offered on account of my possession of a favored talent. And importantly, employers should not offer such higher salaries, for they would then be treating my talents as though they offered reason for compensation, which in fact they do not. So otherwise, if we act in these ways that she's saying we ought not to act, it's a failure of civic virtue. And I've argued that talent is proscribed as a justification for inequality by any reasonable political conception of justice, right? That's a verdict of mutual respect, which, as I said, delineates the space of the reasonable political conceptions of justice. So if that's right, then the political corollary of Schifrin's substantive virtue theory will apply in any well-ordered, reasonable any society well ordered by a reasonable conception of justice. Whatever implications the arbitrariness premise has for the requirements of a well-ordered society, it has those implications for any society well ordered by a reasonable political conception. If a well-ordered society is one in which citizens accept the principles that guide the arrangement of political institutions and the justification for those principles, then in any society well ordered by a reasonable conception of justice, citizens will be bound as a matter of political virtue to act in ways consistent with the acceptance of the political arbitrariness of talent. I think the legitimacy corollary to Schifrin's argument is especially compelling because this ideal of mutual respect among free and equal citizens is precisely the kind of relational virtue that our failure to act with integrity once we accept the justifications for the principles that order our society threatens to undermine. So in fact, I think that, again, if Schifrin's argument is sound, then the translation of it to political liberalism is very difficult to dispute, precisely because the premises that she invokes are entailed by or sort of can be derived from this ideal of mutual respect among free and equal citizens. Okay, the stringency of this, very quickly, this isn't sort of a Cohenian ethos of justice. There's no requirement that we promote some distributive end. We don't have to take positions that we disprefer on their intrinsic merits when taking the position that we prefer on its intrinsic merits would disrupt equality. So it doesn't impose on us any positive requirements to advance some distributive end. The sort of substantive, the political corollary of the substantive virtue theory just restricts the motivations on the basis of which we can decline to do that. So for these reasons, I think relational egalitarianism, the ideal of mutual respect at its heart, are more distributively egalitarian than I think they've been recognized to be. They're distributively egalitarian in a different way, a resourcist way. So the baseline is a baseline of equal shares of our joint social product with which to use to pursue our conception of the good. And so summary and upshots, politically liberal legitimacy is distributively egalitarian. It demands not only a robustly egalitarian institutional arrangement, its fundamental ideals specify that virtuous citizens will not be motivated by or offer additional shares of social product in exchange for their exercise of talent. Thanks.
For some time now, I've been struggling to understand how best to think about the objection to class inequality. I'd like to use my time today to share with you a few of the conclusions to date. Towards the end, I'm going to say something about the way in which the distinctions that I think are important were already present in Rawls, and the way in which I depart from his thinking about economic justice, but for the most part, I'm going to try to present my views in more accessible language with a tip of the hat to Leif Winar's call for accessibility. And I'm going to try to engage directly with the ideas of my fellow Rawls-influenced co-panelists, from whom I've been very fortunate to learn a great deal. So if you will, I'd like to start by telling you about my neighbor, my former neighbor, a woman who used to live next door. I've since moved to a neighborhood she can't afford. Margaret works for as many hours a week as her superiors care to give her at Walmart, yet somehow the dispensation is erratic and always fewer than 30 hours. To pay the bills, Margaret cleans other people's houses for another 15 to 20, and in a good year, she makes enough money to buy a video game at Christmas for her middle school-aged children. Normally, though, she manages to save none of her income and is one root canal away from utter financial disaster, which is why her credit card debt has ballooned over the years and her attractiveness to landlords and lenders has suffered. What she finds most difficult about her situation is that she feels like she's constantly working while her two kids spend most of their non-school hours roaming around unsupervised. Both of Margaret's kids now have average grades for their urban school district, where rates of proficiency in reading and mathematics have long been significantly below the state average. Meanwhile, some of the highest ranked schools in the state are a few miles down the road in another district, along with some of the most expensive urban residential real estate in the country. Over the years, Margaret has had occasion to witness this unprecedented opulence in the course of scrubbing and vacuuming it, but she has no illusions that she herself could ever afford the trappings of the area's typical lifestyle. Margaret's reality illustrates a vast gulf in the fates of American families that even the right now claims to find troubling. Despite this newfound awareness, conservatives offer the same stale diagnoses and remedies, calling on governments to cut taxes and blaming dropouts like Margaret for not making the most of their opportunities in high school. On the left, criticism of the working poor is more muted and the purse strings are markedly looser. Still, the overwhelming focus has been on improving individual prospects for class mobility by expanding opportunities for higher education. Neither of these responses speaks to the full public anxiety on this issue, which is that the comparative lot of our service workers, store clerks, and housekeepers is somehow itself morally deficient. Interestingly, it's not as easy as one might think to find a basis for this common anxiety in contemporary normative thinking. In the social sciences, understanding inequality has become a central research program. Piketty's Capital thrust the program into the cultural mainstream, but it's been a driving force in economics, political science, sociology, and other disciplines for many years now. A different trend has been afoot in normative parts of political philosophy, public policy, and legal scholarship. In the 1980s, a generation of theorists following Ronald Dworkin set out to put egalitarian convictions on a sound philosophical foundation by investigating when differences of wealth and other advantages were in themselves morally objectionable. Yet before long, the project of articulating a normative theory of equality came under fierce attack, with skeptics offering competing non-egalitarian explanations for why real-life inequalities should trouble us. So some claim that what matters fundamentally is not that everyone should have the same, but that everyone should have enough. Thus, the educational system should strive to provide an adequate education to the children of the poor, not the same high-quality education that the richest children get. Others breathe new life into the thought that distributive equality is not valuable at all when inequality would make even the poorest better off. Therefore, the fundamental aim of redistributive policies should not be to make incomes more equal, but to maximize or otherwise prioritize the absolute condition of the worst off. Some have even questioned whether the aim of treating people equally makes any sense at all. Each person has unique developmental needs and goals and will respond to the same opportunities in different ways. Perhaps, then, we should stop comparing the incomparable and embrace some notion of irreducible plurality instead. The observations motivating these attacks on egalitarian reasoning are important to keep in mind. but I believe that to retreat from distributive equality as an ideal would be a serious mistake. We should strive for an egalitarianism that admits the insights behind these attacks, yet unrepentantly demands the same for all in key respects. For that purpose, we need to know where prior normative theories of equality have gone wrong. Equality means different things to different people, but there's broad agreement that it should not mean equality of outcomes. For this reason, criticism of contemporary inequality relies instead on notions of equality of opportunity. On the simplest of these notions, equal opportunity is concerned with fairness in the competition for particular jobs, admission to selective universities, and other one-off opportunities. It requires that the process for awarding these positions not be biased arbitrarily against particular groups of qualified individuals. This is an important standard and underwrites objections not only to active discrimination, but to any selection procedure that facilitates implicit bias. Such bias has now been demonstrated to arise as soon as decision makers learn the race or gender of an applicant. Thus, the simple notion of equal opportunity as a level playing field in moments of selection, particular moments of selection, is already extraordinarily demanding, requiring selection procedures that may be difficult to implement, and in some cases even to imagine. Imagine hiring a surgeon in a colorblind manner. Nonetheless, from the dominant perspective on equality of opportunity, the simple notion is woefully insufficient. On a more expansive notion, fairness of life prospects demands not merely the absence of biased selection procedures at universities and employers, but also the positive provision of equal developmental opportunities from early childhood onwards. Thus, it should be, in principle, impossible to predict a newborn baby's future success using only the income or race or educational attainment of the parents. Each individual at birth is to have the same chance to go as far as his talents and efforts will take him. This expansive notion of equal opportunity has thoroughly captured the public imagination. It motivates our highest governmental initiatives and drives countless studies and experiments. The problem, and I should say in what follows, I'm strongly following Joey Fishkin's beautiful criticisms of these ideas in his book. The problem is that the expansive notion of equality of opportunity sets up an impossible standard for a complex society. As long as we raise children in separate families, parents will read to and counsel and nurture their children in different ways and thereby transmit formative advantages at different rates. There is, moreover, no question of compensating for these formative differences after the fact. Money cannot compensate for the life a person could have lived, the extraordinary person she could have been, had her parents more ably nurtured her incipient interests and talents, and modeled for her a broader and richer array of life plans. Indeed, it seems that nothing can. The project of equalizing the value of the bundle of opportunities that each person enjoys over a complete life is therefore likewise bound to come up short in any society where children are raised by different adults in separate families. This criticism seems bad enough, but familiar equal opportunity doctrines have a shortcoming that's even more severe. Notions of equality of opportunity are at bottom meritocratic in the following sense. They depend on a distinction between the circumstances a person faces and the talents she has and efforts she makes. Standard conceptions insist that how well a person does should track only his talents and efforts, and hence condemn all inequalities traceable to social background. Radical conceptions argue that life prospects shouldn't even track natural differences, and thus call into questions the premiums that go to individuals with scarce natural talents. All of those conceptions therefore require evaluating difficult counterfactuals, such as whether Archibald would still have been the better accountant had Jason had his schooling, upbringing, and mathematical aptitude. But even if such questions were soluble in principle, and Joey's argument argued that they aren't soluble in principle, the bigger problem is that there's no basis for drawing the underlying meritocratic distinctions in the first place. Who will make the better of two airline pilots? The one with perfect vision or the naturally nearsighted? The answer depends on features of the social environment, such as whether corrective eye surgery is available and is tolerated by the overseeing branch of government. Indeed, as Joey stressed, as gene therapy is perfected, the same is increasingly true of all inequalities traceable to natural differences. They are equally the product of social decisions concerning which forms of human engineering should be obligatory, encouraged, or forbidden. Thus, it won't do to distinguish objectionable from unobjectionable inequalities to ask whether they have a natural or a social origins. That move simply begs the question concerning which differences of natural capacity society has a moral responsibility to try to rectify. For meritocratic purposes, nor is there a reasonable way to distinguish a person's efforts from his circumstances. For clearly, a person's efforts and ambitions are strongly endogenous to his circumstances. The aims that a person comes to have in life depend on what was modeled for him as a real possibility in his formative years. Similarly, the effort a person is willing to make will quite reasonably depend on how far he thinks his talents, circumstances, and upbringing can take him. Following John Romer, we can of course try to make inferences about the effort that a person would have been willing to make by observing how other individuals in more fortunate circumstances actually behaved. But once again, as Joey Fishkin has beautifully argued in his wonderful book, such inferences always depend on the dubious assumption that human beings don't form their own unique aspirations when faced with the same menu of developmental options. On the contrary, such pluralism has long been recognized as one of our most basic reasons for caring about people's opportunities. It's led recent liberals in the tradition of John Stuart Mill, notably Fishkin, to advance similar criticisms in an effort to shift the focus from the inequality to the waning diversity of opportunity. Not everyone needs to go to a four-year college to have a meaningful and productive life, yet increasingly, a bachelor's degree is necessary for even the lowest paid jobs. Understandably, family ambitions converge on the conventional college track, and governmental priorities predictably follow suit. But perhaps instead of helping children master the same standardized tests, the social priority should be to expand the range and diversity of accessible lives and the various paths that individuals may take. So that last suggestion put forward by Fishkin is helpful, I think, as far as it goes. From my point of view, the problem is that egalitarian standards of political morality play an altogether different role. They express political requirements that take priority over more open-ended social aims, such as cultural diversity, scientific progress, and economic growth, and thereby help to define how societies may pursue any of those further goals. A call to make the range of opportunity ever broader cannot play that role, particularly since resources are limited and choices have to be made. How else can ideas of distributive equality provide us with the needed guidance? I believe that to answer this question, we have to distinguish more precisely the types of individual complaint that these ideas warrant. At times, equality of opportunity is invoked to discipline the social process for allocating scarce goods. Thus, it's often said that the admissions process to the Ivy League universities is unfair because it so heavily favors the children of the rich, and that it's unfair for supremely qualified women to be so rarely appointed CEOs. These are complaints about the terms on which particular groups of individuals compete for certain enviable scarce rewards. Ideas of equality of opportunity underwrite these complaints and at the same time provide morally significant direction for reform when they insist that each individual from the appropriate reference class should have the same opportunity to compete for the particular rewarded hand. Whether that means evaluating all interested applicants strictly on the merits, providing disadvantaged individuals with the necessary prior training, or guaranteeing equal prospects of success for each member of the reference class in the process of selection, that's going to vary with the particular conception of equality of opportunity in question. But no matter how that general notion is specified, it plays a distinct role whenever it is invoked to identify unfairness in some process for allocating scarce goods or special roles. That is, however, not the only way that an egalitarian complaint can be understood. Often, what is at work is not the claim that each person should have the same opportunity to attain some scarce good. It's the entirely distinct idea that each person who takes the same steps should have the same social good or benefit. And it's the latter idea that is invoked when people broadly lament the declining fortunes of the working class. Working mothers clean other people's toilets for 60 precarious hours a week, yet still can't make ends meet. Why is that an affront? Not principally because they can't compete on fair terms to become Surgeon General or Chief Astronaut. Special roles not everyone can nor should have. Rather, despised precarious drudgery is such an affront because each person who works hard should end up with a secure, esteemed, and well-paying job. Each person who works hard should have high-quality health insurance, a comfortable retirement, and so on. With respect to these and various other important goods, persons have what I want to call conditional claims to equal outcomes. Of course, perhaps such conditional claims to equal outcomes are sometimes overridable by considerations of efficiency. For example, some medical treatments are simply too expensive to provide to each and every citizen. If allowing the wealthy to buy private insurance that covers such treatments spurs technological innovation, so that the kind of medical care that can be feasibly funded for everyone improves in the long run, then perhaps that is sufficient reason to allow such inequalities of outcome. Even so, however, this reason merely outweighs the reason to ensure that everyone who works hard has access to the same high-quality medical treatment. It doesn't mean there never was any such reason. Overridable conditional claims to equal outcomes are still conditional claims to equal outcomes. And such claims are altogether distinct from claims to an equal opportunity to compete on fair terms for some scarce good or role that not everyone can have. For a variety of reasons, this distinction is frequently passed over not only in political argument, but in the course of academic study. Thus, philosophers specify principles of justice meant to govern the distribution of already scarce resources, and social scientists implicitly draw on these principles when they frame their studies of actual inequalities. Owing to that focus, questions concerning who winds up at Harvard and at Walmart take on outsized importance when, from an egalitarian perspective, the unevenness of the playing field is hardly the only issue. On the contrary, even if by some miracle we manage to give every last person the same top-flight education, it's not as if suddenly no one would be scrubbing floors or picking lettuce. Management would perhaps become a socially more representative kaleidoscope, but barring radical changes to our occupational structure, someone would still be cleaning corporate bathrooms. Evidently, then, I think, much recent interest in the growth of inequality has been seriously myopic in its underlying motivations. Too often, the inquiry is proceeded as if the deepest issue were the fairness of the process whereby children from this or that background are sorted into our disparate class positions. Yet, from an egalitarian perspective, what matters much more fundamentally is what these class positions, which ultimately someone will wind up in, are like in the first place. From that perspective, even the world's most advanced economies do not look so great on any honest assessment. First, the commanding roles today are few, and they have too much power and authority attached. The prerogatives of corporate managers like Margaret's include powers over others that no one should have. Recall that screaming at an employee all day long to get her to stock shelves or flip burgers faster does not constitute unlawful harassment if it serves a legitimate business purpose. The problem here is not that into the hiring, sorting, and selection process some unfairness may have crept. The problem is that it's wrong for anyone to be allowed to have such despicable, asymmetrical powers over other people's lives. And yet these legally sanctioned practices of subordination, bullying, and compulsion are indignities that millions of so-called free and equal citizens must face on a daily basis. The legal powers and prerogatives that make these practices possible are ones that strictly no one should be allowed to compete for. On the other end, the same goes for the liabilities that now attend the far less desirable roles that someone must inevitably perform. Constant supervision, no room for initiative, crummy health benefits, lifelong financial insecurity. These are liabilities that no one should have to suffer from, assuming everyone does whatever society can reasonably ask of him or her. With respect to these important goods, at least, people have conditional claims to equal outcomes. Such claims simply tend to be confused with claims concerning what constitutes fairness in selection for the various social roles. That is, then, in my view, a deep confusion evident in common ways of articulating the objection to contemporary inequality. Needless to say, it's going to have immediate bearing on how we are to evaluate existing inequality. Before we can declare that the process for relegating Margaret to her subservient position in our society has been altogether fair, we must first explain why hers is a social role which it's permissible for our society to have, not merely in general, but with the usual rewards and liabilities attached. And yet, that can't be done except by reference to the conditional claims to equal outcomes that everyone has. The goods, powers, immunities, resources, forms of social standing, and so on, that each and every person should enjoy, as long as he or she does whatever can be reasonably asked of him or her. Hence, requirements of competitive equality of opportunity are far from the only important egalitarian standards after all. At best, such ideas can help us to discern why the growing lack of class mobility is wrong. But much more urgently, what we need to know is what are the social deficits that no one should have to suffer from. For that purpose, I think we need to spell out all of the particular conditional claims to equal outcomes that everyone has, and only then will we come to grips with what's morally rotten about class inequality as such. My aim in the work from which this presentation draws is to redirect our focus on this task. In closing, let me offer a few words about affinities and differences with Rawls. Most importantly, Rawls understood and took for granted one of the main points at which I've arrived, with his and many other people's help, namely that the deepest objections to contemporary inequality are not best understood as failures of equality of opportunity. Admittedly, the exposition in a theory of justice has long misled people. The informal arguments for the two principles of justice strongly suggested that the difference principle comes in to solve an imperfection in fair equality of opportunity, and hence that the difference principle may be understood to be a more perfect solution to the same underlying problem. And as Tim and Joey both mentioned, Rawls also offered a self-realization rationale for the importance of fair equality of opportunity. I think those features of the exposition were mistakes from Rawls's own point of view. The self-realization rationale is out of place because fair equality of opportunity is ultimately a principle of fairness in selection in the widest sense. That's to say, in a just society, the presence of fair equality of opportunity would help to answer questions of the following kind. Why is it fair for you rather than me to have ended up with this special position that both of us wanted, but not both of us can nor should have? Since it's understood that ultimately only some of us will get the self-realization that's enabled by playing this or that special role, it's out of place to justify a doctrine of competitive equality of opportunity by pointing to the importance for everyone of that good. For the same reason, it was unfortunate, I think, for Rawls to have left the impression that the difference principle was a less arbitrary and more perfect version of fair equality of opportunity. That impression was particularly fateful since it directly inspired the development of luck egalitarianism, the theory that the objection to contemporary inequality can be traced back to a single master egalitarian principle with an opportunity egalitarian form. Yet clearly, for Rawls, that is not so. If the inequalities set up by the basic structure are to count as just, then the overall process whereby children are sorted into the different social positions must be fair. Fair equality of opportunity helps to explain when that will be the case. In addition, however, the differences characteristic of our social positions, that's to say their intrinsic powers, prerogatives, and the external schedule of rewards, must themselves be justified somehow. The difference principle plays the separate prior role. So this is, again, how I now think about the subject matter. The heterogeneous bundle of ideas that commonly goes under the label of equality of opportunity, including ideas of non-discrimination and various notions of procedural fairness, are at bottom claims concerning what makes for unfairness in the social process for allocating properly scarce goods and positions. Requirements concerning the distribution of properly scarce goods and positions certainly are a part of the content of distributive equality, but they're far from the whole story. Indeed, before such requirements can even come to have application, you have to ask a prior question. Which goods, resources, powers, prerogatives, forms of social standing, and so on, should our institutions make or allow to be scarce in the first place? And which goods should each and every person enjoy to the same degree, provided he does whatever can be reasonably asked of him? The difference principle is Rawls's answer to that prior and more basic question. It's a principle not of a more perfect form of equal opportunity, but a statement of the conditional claims to equal outcomes that everyone has. More precisely, the difference principle summarizes the judgment that persons have a conditional, overridable claim to the same high index of authority and responsibility and income and wealth, conditional on full participation in social cooperation, and overridable by a special subset of efficiency considerations, namely maxi-min considerations. I disagree with Rawls that this statement exhausts the particular conditional claims to equal outcomes that people have. I don't think anything is gained by speaking of claims to an index of these goods. In my view, we'll do better by spelling out the conditional claims to equal outcomes in respect of particular goods and states of affairs that people have, or what each person should be in a position to enjoy to the same degree simultaneously, provided he does whatever can be reasonably asked of him. And finally, I think Rawls was wrong to think that it's always permissible to asymmetrically lift all boats, particularly when it comes to the distribution of authority over matters of common concern, such as what kind of work each person will do and how that work will go. I think there'll be quite a bit more permissible leveling down than many people following Rawls have supposed. Yet in the end, I think it's fair to consider these disagreements as family disputes that ultimately place me on one side with Rawls, with luck egalitarians and anti-egalitarians of all kinds on the other side. If I may then, let me just briefly finish by noting one point where I am beginning to disagree. This concerns the types of economic institutions that are necessary to eliminate objectionable inequalities of various kinds. Though many commentators continue to ignore this judgment, Rawls's considered view was that justice is incompatible with, strictly unachievable under, the institutions of a liberal welfare state, capitalism. Of the United States in particular, he wrote, and I quote, "When politicians are beholden to their constituents for essential campaign funds, and a very unequal distribution of income and wealth obtains in the background, with the great wealth being in control of the corporate economic power, is it any wonder that congressional legislation is in effect written by lobbyists, and Congress becomes a bargaining chamber in which laws are bought and sold?" Unquote. According to Rawls, even a generous form of welfare state capitalism was incapable of achieving social justice. To be sure, with luck, though capitalist welfare state could manage to provide reasonably high quality universal public services like education and healthcare. However, by limiting itself to redistributing income and wealth, so to speak, after the basic economic facts of capitalist economic life, the welfare state allows large concentrations of wealth to arise and to persist, and these concentrations permit the rich to dominate political life and thereby to monopolize the commanding roles and the lion's share of the rewards in the economy itself. Rawls thought that the only antidote to this problem was a change to the, or came to think that the only antidote to this problem was a change to the basic economic structure of society. In particular, he thought that justice requires either a liberal form of market socialism, under which there would be free choice of occupation and a market for consumer goods and services, but the means of production would be publicly owned and rented out to worker-managed firms by a national investment bank organized for that very purpose. Or else we could have what James Mead called a property-owning democracy, which would allow for private ownership of the means of production, but would actively limit and disperse the concentration of wealth through a high level of education and confiscatory inheritance taxes. I have to say that I'm beginning to think that this non-committal posture was a mistake. In particular, I think Rawls failed to appreciate the ways in which modern life depends on the output of industries and productive processes that involve enormous economies of scale, requiring massive upfront concentrations of physical capital and labor. Where are the independent entrepreneurs and worker collectives that Rawls envisages as part of a property-owning democracy supposed to get these massive concentrations of capital? There are, I'm now starting to believe, only two ways. They can get them from a network of publicly owned banks and financial institutions that have not just the bottom line, but the wider aims of justice as fairness as their mission, in which case, the most important means of production will in effect be publicly owned, and we are in a liberal form of market socialism. Alternatively, entrepreneurs and upstart businesses can get their infusions of capital from privately owned concentrations of that capital, which will need to be massive to play the requisite economic purpose. But then we are stuck once again with all of the problems that led Rawls to forswear even the most generous forms of welfare state capitalism. I think that's an issue on which students of Rawls have still to make up their minds. Thank you very much.
I am keenly aware we have a half hour left, and we have inadvertently structured a kind of debate, but I trust your questions will bring out some of the rival positions here. So I want to open it up right now. Stephen.
So this is a question. Well, first, thanks to all three of you. It was all wonderful. Yes, please. I'm okay. This is for Lucas. Just in terms of the structure of the theory of justice, I'm wondering whether the concerns that you're mentioning, which I entirely agree with, wouldn't be met by an expansion of the equal basic liberties to include things like worker rights. So you mentioned the two outstanding issues that Margaret's life faces. One is the quality of her work life, and the second is the precarity of her work, given the way the market works and so on. So it seems like there ought to be much more robust worker rights, workplace democracy, something like that, on the one hand. And it seems also that there ought to be some kind of substantial economic floor that doesn't create the kind of precarity that she faces. Of course, there may be other substantial egalitarian concerns, but I'm just wondering whether that's not a place to locate some of these thoughts.
In general, I think I'll say there are many places in the theory that one can introduce further concerns for precarity and the nature of the work, and try to articulate the content of robust workplace rights and labor protections. The first principle would be one place where the liberties that constitute that principle have to be specified. What does it mean for citizens to have freedom of movement? What are the constitutive protections that should be thought to be constitutive of that liberty as a basic right? What about the constitutive protections of a right to free choice of occupation and freedom of association, insofar as that is a cognate and supporting liberty for all kinds of other things? You can build things in there. You can, of course, also build them into the difference principle if the difference principle ranges over not only income and wealth, but a bundle of powers and prerogatives of office as constitutive of the positions that people inhabit in our highly detailed division of labor. The best article on this continues to be this article that was published 6 or 7 years ago called The Difference Principle at Work by a guy named Sam Arnold, which extends the application of the difference principle to the division of labor. So one can do that.
My thought was that the basic liberty principle trumps, it's lexically prior, and it's egalitarian full stop. I mean, there's no balancing of trading off or anything like that. So it seems to have the right structure. Yeah.
Yep.
Mira.
I have a question for the panel. It's sort of two interrelated questions. One is, it struck me in listening to the three of you, in some ways, I've always been curious about, say, why Michael Walzer's complex equality hasn't taken in the same way that, say, Rawls took. And in some ways, what I hear you articulating is a spheres of justice account, potentially, right? That in your critique of saying fair equality of opportunity, just, you know, as a matter of social science, whether or not it ever was plausible, it certainly ain't plausible now or in the future, right? That one way of responding to that, which is kind of what I'm hearing you talk about, but I'm not sure, is to say we should be able to separate the spheres in which we work such that, or in which we live, such that, say, whether it's educational inequality, genetic inequality, employment inequality, political inequality, right, you know, doesn't end up impacting the other spheres of our lives, because a lot of what I hear you articulating the injustice of is when these pile on top of one another, right? That leads me to the sort of second feature of my question, which is that as I'm curious, and Lucas's presentation sort of highlighted this for me. I'm wondering whether the distinctions so today there's been broken down the distinction between, say, the natural goods and social goods, right? We've had the breakdown of the divisions between rights and distributional mechanisms, right? We've had the breakdown between what's adequate, what's egalitarian, and say what's just, which may, you know, be one or the other of those or in between them or whatever. And we've had a little bit of the breakdown between the basic structure and other features of where we live our collective and engage with our collective political life. I'm curious, at what point then does the intellectual structure that Rawls has given us break down? Or is this a project that you see yourselves as being a sort of reconstruction? If each of the each of the bricks ends up being challenges or reconstructed, at what point do we have a whole new animal? Or should we seek a whole new animal? That was a mixed metaphor, so you can ignore the last bit.
Well, I'll just speak briefly to maybe the first part. As you can probably guess from the kind of opportunity pluralism idea I laid out, reading Spheres of Justice was very formative for me, and I find it very powerful set of ideas as far as it goes, which the trouble is, for me, in thinking about equality of opportunity, defining several spheres instead of one doesn't get you that far. You're still going to have the potential for elites to perpetuate themselves, even just within one sphere. Of course, it would be great if we could at least get the political influence out of the economic, but it just doesn't quite capture the extent to which I think we need to think about pluralism. But I think it would be wrong to say that it hasn't taken. I think a lot of people going to graduate school in our cohort read and think about it quite a bit. It's just a question of how far it reaches. And I'll just say to the second part, for me, I view myself as although I have a lot of problems with Rawlsian fair equality of opportunity, myself as not a very disobedient Rawls student, in the sense that I still see fair equality of opportunity as only getting us so far. And I thought Lucas brought out very well some of what the entire set of questions surrounding opportunity doesn't reach.
I think I would just agree with part of that, which is, so the spheres of justice seems, that idea as an idea of justice seems insufficient, in that I think that inequalities in one particular sphere that don't bleed over into other spheres can nonetheless be unjust. But parts of that can be helpful, and I think that my use of Rawlsian resources is just sort of that. Like, I think that there are these basic commitments that are very helpful, and I think, Rawls wasn't always right about the implications of them or the extension of certain things. But for me, the idea of justificatory community as a way of dealing with profound disagreement is really inspiring, and I think I think this is why, even though I don't feel like a political liberal, I find myself doing things in political liberalism, because I think that ideal is attractive enough that it's worth seeing how capacious it can be as a way of organizing our calls for reform. And so to try to be faithful enough to the project that you're using those sort of fundamental commitments in the spirit in which they were intended, but not necessarily feeling like to use them you have to follow them to the conclusions that Rawls built on their basis. That's why I think it's not worth, the revision that I want to make isn't one that would lead us to scrap the project.
I'll just say very quickly about your first question about a hypothesis about why Walzer's complex equality didn't take. I think lots of reasons for that, aside from the reason that the Walzer of spheres of justice was a conventionalist relativist. The fact that I think it's a great virtue of Rawls's approach that it's not compartmentalized in that way, and takes it for granted that the economic sphere can't be separated from the political sphere, can't be separated from the essential political legal constitution of civil society, and that you have to think about the basic structure as a whole and how, yeah.
Frank Michaelman.
This is for Joey. It's a little bit ad hominem, but in what I hope you'll take as a friendly way. Opportunity pluralism. That comes in response to the quest for fairness and basic structure in the terms of social cooperation, as that bears on the prospects and fates of individuals taken one by one, right? Fates and prospects of individuals. it's in that respect a deeply liberal project and pursuit, in which associational interests, claims of associational freedom, come in as a problem to be worked around by the device of opportunity pluralism. That is, you want to reckon, you don't want to deny or subjugate the associational claims, but opportunity pluralism is a workaround for a problem that the family poses to fair equality of opportunity. You are engaged at the same time in another project, which you call the Anti-Oligarchy Constitution. And in that project, the targeted political moral evil is class stratification, right, in the distribution of access and influence over, over aspects of the basic structure and matters of basic justice. So that project is concerned with the prospects and fates of social classes. It contemplates their indefinite continuation in our social and political life. And one might say it comes out of a tradition that people call Republican, distinguished from the opportunity pluralism coming out of a tradition that people call liberal. So my question is how you see the relationship between these two. Are they complementary and mutually reinforcing? Or are they just separate and don't touch? Or is there, in fact, some tension between them? I put this as a, you see the ad hominem part, one project, another project.
Sure.
I call it friendly because it would give you an opportunity to respond to me by questioning, the opposition that some contemporary theory likes to draw between the Republican and the liberal traditions. I myself have a doubt, a very serious doubt about that opposition, but it seemed to me that the simultaneity in your work of these two projects might express in some indirect way as similar.
Yeah, well, you're not only asking, but giving me a better answer than the one that I was going to start in with, so I think you're absolutely right that this other project I won't burden everyone with, but that has a more of a U.S. constitutional roots and is therefore much more explicitly in the Republican tradition. Is more about social class. But I would say a major point of continuity between these two projects, and there are a few, and I won't take up a lot of time, a major point of continuity is I have a lot of skepticism about a different division relevant to both projects, which is the division between individual prospects and opportunities on the one hand and class inequalities and the magnitude of absolute differences in income and wealth on the other. It's extremely non-coincidental that the societies in places like Scandinavia that have the smallest absolute differences in income and wealth also have a lot more social mobility, and individuals' prospects are not quite as class dependent. The further apart we go on the absolute scale, the more difficult it is to build the bridges on the opportunity scale. And so while I think the kind of Rawlsian, the sort of inherited Rawlsian, two-part way of thinking about these problems is, a useful starting point, it seems to me that fair equality of opportunity actually, as a practical matter, is going to require a lot of constraints, maybe more than Rawls thought, because he wasn't living through this Gilded Age, on absolute differences in income and wealth. You're just not going to be able to separate those two, and I think that brings my two projects a lot closer together.
Brian.
So my question's for Gina. Sorry? Oh, I'm Brian Berkey from the University of Pennsylvania. My question's for Gina. So Lucas was explicit that, on his view, we should allow more leveling down than kind of Rawlsians and many others have traditionally allowed. And I wonder if this is also an implication of your view. So you want to deny that the principles of justice apply to individuals in the way that people like Cohen think they do. And so this means, for example, that, take Cohen's Dr. Gardner kind of case, right? So if there's somebody who would prefer to be a gardener at an average salary than to be a doctor at an average salary, but would be willing to be a doctor for a bunch more money, right? It seems like if you want to allow that this person isn't obligated to be a doctor for an average salary, assuming that, say, her life would still be better than that of most people in the society, then it looks like the distributive demands of mutual respect that you described and the kind of reasons for thinking that they impose these kind of robustly egalitarian constraints might give us a reason to think that the state should kind of prevent or take steps, if not explicitly prevent, but take steps that would potentially have the effect that this person the incentives aren't available, right? So that the inequality that could make everyone better off just doesn't arise, so that it looks like you might get this kind of leveling down effect. And maybe this is just a matter of kind of whether we should think that the values that kind of underlie this account of the distributive demands of mutual respect should kind of take priority over, promoting everyone's, increasing everyone's share of primary goods or whatever it might be. But I'm curious whether you first agree that your view might have these kind of leveling down implications, and if so, kind of what you make of that.
Yeah, so this is one of the reasons why it seems important to me to try to categorize the reasons that we have for arranging our institutional structure in certain ways as being the reasons deriving from this value of mutual respect versus some particular political conception of justice, and trying to keep those things distinct. Because it seems like we do have reasons deriving from the value of mutual respect, if the argument that I gave is right, for arranging the institutional structure such that jobs don't, so doing, basically arranging the labor structure in the way that you described that has the leveling down effect. And it might be the case that there are countervailing reasons coming from the ideal of mutual respect if we need people to be lured into these particular positions in order to, meet the adequacy threshold for all citizens so that we can all stand as social equals or something like that. And our political conception of justice might furnish additional reasons to do that, but we have the sort of standing sort of baseline reason not to. And I think that can influence the institutional structure at other places too. So it might be that I think that it's consistent with saying that the principles of justice don't apply to individual behavior to say that the principles of justice do give us reasons to arrange the institutions in ways that influence individual behavior so that they behave in more justice conducive ways. And so we might have a strong case for educating citizens in certain ways that encourage social solidarity. And we can do this now consistent with justificatory reciprocity because we have this politically liberal argument for a baseline of distributive equality. And so I think so one of the reasons that I'm concerned to try to make this work is that I think that gives us leverage to do things in other parts of the social structure that it looks like are inconsistent with the commitments of political liberalism that I think, in fact, maybe not, and might actually be like that. The commitments of political liberalism might give us positive reasons to do those things after all. So,
I'm going to start pairs of two. Conveniently, Charles and Roni are sitting next to each other, so that's the first pair.
I'm Charles Peterson. I'm a fellow at the Sapper Center and a PhD student in American Studies at Harvard. So I'm a historian, so I hope you'll forgive these questions, but I think they have a normative upshot. So first, for Lucas, I think it's worth pointing out that it's not really an accident that equality of outcomes has been understood as it has for the past 50 years of political theory and political philosophy. At least in my research, the term was basically introduced into modern political discourse by Nathan Glaser, a sociologist who just died a few days ago, who was at Harvard. And he was popularized again, I think most prominently, by Daniel Bell in his response to Rawls in 1973. And Glaser introduced it basically as a response to African American demands for basic goods, and Bell pushed it again. I've seen in his archive in a response to demands for women. So I think to me this brings out how much both Rawls himself was writing at a deeply conservative moment in American intellectual history, and how much his legacy has been interpreted at an increasingly conservative moment. So again, I think as Katrina asked yesterday, this for me leads me to wonder, should we really go back and try to recover some version of Rawls that would be acceptable to us today, or would it be more worthwhile to move on and do our own theorizing? And then second, for Joey, on the question of self-realization and pluralism, a lot of the people that I've looked at most closely in the 1960s who end up embracing meritocracy are the people who are most obsessed with self-realization. And to me, this brings out how dangerous self-realization is as a goal. Because it's very easy to hold a sentimental view that if we just allow everyone to have resources, if we open up enough opportunities, then we'll have, everyone will be able to pursue self-realization in an equal way. But it seems like it's very difficult to actually have a world in which self-realization is not viewed in hierarchical ways. We can all be pursuing our own life paths, but it seems that people almost inevitably compare one another. So wouldn't it be better, again, I think, to highlight something that Lucas said, to focus on goods that can actually just be distributed in a truly egalitarian way and don't lead to this kind of competition?
Ronnie Hirsch, also in the Suffer Center. So I have a question for Lucas, and please excuse me if I misheard you out of wishful thinking, but it sounded to me like you want to make a case for one of the two options that Rawls prioritized for systems of political economy, so the market. So were you weighing in on this debate of market socialism versus property owning democracy? And were you taking the stand of market socialism, and was that on a principled approach or an empirical suggestion? And just if you want to talk a bit more about this debate.
I'm going to add one more to your right, Roni. One more question.
Fantastic. I think my question is for Lucas, and it's the sort of corollary of this question that was asked to Gina, specifically on the question of the leveling down. So you describe some things that occur in some occupations as some like regrettable, and I wonder, in light of scarcity, how we should think about sort of your system and the resources it has to sort of. So Gina's response was, look, you might have other considerations in virtue of the desire for mutual respect and political liberalism that might weigh against having prohibitions on some occupations in virtue of leveling down. I wonder if you have a comparable response, just in virtue of sort of scarcity. So I think median income in the world is about $3,000, say maybe $10,000 average. So you just think there'd be, in the world that we live in, there'll be some amount of these features are going to exist. So I wonder how we should think about your system in light of that.
Who's going to start?
Oh, okay. Just very briefly to the first, I think we're all doing our own theorizing, and then we ask ourselves, what should we think about? It looks like the justice of the basic structure is important, and so on and so forth. So, I think we've all taken your advice. And then to Roni's question, I would just say, if you have the let me just put it judiciously, if you have the concerns that Rawls has about the influence of wealth on political equality and fair equality of opportunity and economic rewards, then it's incumbent on you to investigate what a realistic political economy would look like that would overcome the problems that Rawls thinks are perennial under welfare state capitalism. And here's just my emerging considered view, that those of us who work in the Rawlsian tradition haven't done enough of that. We've ignored, in particular, we've ignored the finance sector, the regulation of money, and haven't, I think, engaged enough with the question of the supply of investment capital for large modern enterprises.
So I'll just say something really briefly in response to Charles' question about self-realization or self-actualization. I think it's not a shock that some people would be very into both an idea of self-realization and an idea of meritocracy. Both, circling back to Frank, are extremely individualistic liberal notions that have a certain affinity with one another. But there's something amazingly sad about the idea of imagining self-realization in a basically hierarchical, my realization is to get to the top of the heap sort of way. And because I view the question of in what way will people conceptualize how they want to, what they want to become as a completely constructed product of social arrangements and institutions, it seems to me that you've put your finger on the problem that needs solving, which is we need a society in which people's sense of what it would be to be a more actualized person, to become the person they want to be, isn't so competitive. And if we don't have that, then I don't think we're going to get any kind of equality of opportunity.
Do you want to, was one of them addressed? Do you know? We have 3 minutes left and a group, so I'm going to simply cut it off with Katrina as the last question, tragically.
I'm not sure this is going to be the most productive last question, but it's for Lucas. But I'd be interested in the rest of your thoughts as well, which is, Lucas, you ended up with going towards liberal socialism versus property-owning democracy. But at one point, your critique of equality of opportunity, I thought you were going to go towards the abolition of the family, and in a kind of radical feminist route of actually saying family is the site of injustice of social reproduction and so on. It seemed like you were going in that direction, and does your system at all allow for those kinds of critiques of the family in a very deep sense or not? That's the kind of question.
No, I think that's a mistake. It's been a mistake to represent fair equality of opportunity or, in general, norms of fairness and selection as being seriously in tension with the institution of the nuclear family. The mistake is generated by seeing that so much rides on the economic competition of whether your child gets into college, because there's only a few positions at the top of our class structure that have all of the goods attached that ultimately everyone should enjoy, and those who don't wind up in those positions live lives of deprivation and social deficit. And then people are like, it's the family that doesn't allow us to give equal prospects for all children from all social classes. But that's exactly the wrong way around. The trouble here is that the positions in their class structure is organized in a way that it does not indeed permit everyone to enjoy all of the goods that each and every person should enjoy, provided they do whatever can be reasonably asked of them. And it's a mistake to focus on questions about fair sorting into different positions if that's your ultimate concern.
I want to thank our panelists.